China's President Xi Jinping has signed dozens of agreements with Vietnam, including trade deals, as the tariff dispute with the US continues. His visit to Hanoi is part of a long-planned trip through Southeast Asia. China is currently facing 145% duties imposed by US President Donald Trump. The Chinese leader called for stronger ties with Vietnam. He's also visiting Malaysia and Cambodia this week. Now, let's go to Ian Chong. He's a political scientist from Singapore, focusing on security issues relating to China and Asia. President Donald Trump claims the meeting in Vietnam was just about hurting the US. Is that Trump being Trump, or is there real intent behind Beijing's timing?
I suppose what Beijing is seeking is to shore up its ties and to find partners at a time when its trade with the United States is under stress. Vietnam, of course, under the threat of a lot of tariffs too, is looking for options. I don't think Vietnam in particular is looking to hurt the United States. It wants to maintain good ties with Washington too. So I suppose that's one of these things where Trump is sort of being Trump and maybe exaggerating things a little bit, but there is a sense that Beijing is trying to capitalize on the inattention that Washington is currently having with regard to its partners and allies in Asia.
Now, how long do you think can Vietnam make this tightrope walk in the relationships between US and China without falling off on either side?
Well, Vietnam, I think of all countries, has been very adept at doing this. But your larger point, I would agree with. It is becoming increasingly difficult. With the view, I think from Trump's comments, what we can draw is that the current administration in Washington sees working with the PRC as potentially detrimental to its own interests. So it may see efforts to reach out and to diversify as inimical to its own position. So it could potentially put more pressure on these third parties as well. Now, Vietnam, of course, has territorial disputes with the PRC. It also has important rivers that originate in the PRC, and the damming of those rivers upstream affects ecosystems and livelihoods downstream. So Vietnam is in a particularly sort of challenging position. It does have a degree of trade with the PRC, but it really cannot just depend on the PRC market. So it really has to look for different options.
Now, you think China is trying to redraw the map of Southeast Asia with the US pushed out of the picture?
So the PRC certainly is trying to consolidate its ties. If you look at the visits by Xi Jinping this time around, Malaysia, Cambodia, Vietnam, all countries that have tried hard to manage their relationship with Beijing, if not really sort of try to bolster them in the case of Cambodia. So I don't know whether it's a matter of the United States being pushed out as opposed to the US being perhaps less interested and the PRC finding an opportunity to perhaps backfill that vacuum, that need for economic certainty a little bit more.
Ian Chong there, political scientist. Thank you very much, Ian.
You're welcome.
Let's bring in our correspondent in Taipei, in Taiwan, Melissa Chan. Tell us more about the outcome of Xi's visit to Vietnam.
Well, Chinese state media is making a big deal about the more than 40-plus agreements that they signed, but I would caution that I've covered a lot of these diplomatic meetings between two leaders, and they love signing these memorandum of understanding. They tend not to be legally binding. We don't have a lot of information about them, and we also don't have any information about whether there are any financing deals as a result of these agreements. When we do follow up on these MOUs, a year later, 2 years later, it turns out that a lot of this is just paper that's been sitting on a desk, and there hasn't been much more beyond that. So I would caution. It sounds like a big spate of agreements between the two sides, but this is one to watch. Clear wins, though, for China is that Vietnam has agreed to accept Chinese funding in order to build railways connecting the two countries. The other thing is that China has been really trying to push its domestic plane company that has really failed to compete competitively, like internationally, with Boeing and Airbus. COMAC is what it's called, and Vietnam has agreed to at least lease or potentially buy a few of these planes. So those are the wins. But again, Vietnam is going to continue to try to engage with the United States in terms of a tariff negotiation and agreement. And at the end of the day, its big manufacturing industry sells to the United States and sells to Europe, and it doesn't sell as much to China, where the consumer base is just not that strong. So Vietnam is going to walk that line between the United States and China.
So, Melissa, apart from all the paperwork, did she say anything about the trade war with the US?
Well, interestingly, she actually wrote an opinion or editorial in Vietnam's big national paper saying that there are no winners in any trade war. And that can be interpreted as an entryway to negotiate with the Americans. I mean, it's important to keep in mind that the Chinese economy has been struggling, and it's been in bad shape. It hasn't been in as good a shape as the U.S. economy. So there's every incentive for Beijing to want to talk to the Americans. But I'm reminded of the phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick, because here you have Xi being quite conciliatory in the language. But China, of course, has responded with reciprocal tariffs, and particularly with the limitation of exports of those precious rare earth minerals to the United States. That is the hardball play that China is doing. And ultimately, though, it does want to try to settle this with the Americans.
Thank you for those insights. Melissa Chan there for us.